Thank you. Namaskar and good evening. It's a privilege and honor to be here today. Thank you, Anirbanji, for the invitation. And this is my first time at the foundation, so very happy to be here. I think the topic is very timely, as you rightly pointed out, both in terms of my article and the trigger for that, the spate of other articles and commentary that we've been seeing regarding democracy. And it's kind of very odd that how this narrative has been created. Because if you look at the contrast, right, between India and the United States, recently the United States Supreme Court, you know, overturned a decades-old verdict on abortion rights and said that there is no constitutional right to abortion. I mean, that's as illiberal move that can happen. But then it is India that is being judged on this whole yardstick of liberal democracy. Similarly, I was very stunned to read about this. Someone shared this on Twitter, that there are more than 1,200 textbooks that have been banned in the United States by different school districts. So, I mean, 1,200 book bans. Yeah, एक book ban होता है तो it's like the world has ended. International news. 1,200 textbook bans, right? And you made a very pertinent point, right? How democracy is kind of in the recession in the West, especially with low turnouts, and this has been going on for several years now. That their turnouts are generally low. The interest in participatory democracy is very limited. In fact, democracy there is largely a contest between vocal minorities. You have special lobbies and special groups which are very loud, and largely it is competition between them. And what we have achieved in India with electoral democracy, as you rightly pointed out, I think is stunning. Right? I mean, no other country is a billion people democracy in the planet. We are the only ones, and that's clearly something that is rankling a lot of people. The next nearest democracy, the US, is probably less than 1/3 of our population, and we are also the oldest civilization with a democratic ethos. It may not be democracy as they define it, but nevertheless, it is in our ethos. It's our legacy, and I think both these together have kind of unsettled many of them. It baffles them, it exasperates them, and our success, is a repudiation of their way of thinking, their values that they profess, and what they believe is the idea of India. And this is basically an exercise about forcing their idea of India on us, and I think that is basically what it comes down to. And we as a society are quite generous and kind, right? I mean, look at what happened recently in Thailand. A minor transgression by the CNN, and they immediately cancelled their visas and halt them, right? While we had these fellows doing drone photography of funeral pyres, and we didn't do anything. So I mean, so that is about as liberal as generous and kind that we can. But there is underlying this whole narrative, there is a very strong undercurrent of racism, and which is again evident. We've seen recently with the British Home Secretary's remarks, and the reactions to that from journalists, that how beneficial colonialism was, or how there were collaborators in India. I mean, so that mindset is what is manifesting itself in all this narrative that we are seeing. And we are also, I think, very uniquely vulnerable to these global pressures, because we have a very hostile neighborhood, neighbors who have many incentives to undermine democracy in India. In fact, the trigger to this article in the Indian Express and the earlier one in the print was this article that came in the New York Times, where this gentleman who lives in Hong Kong and then lectures India about democracy and freedom. So I was very curious, because this guy is hardly known. He gets prime space on New York Times. He earlier got a lot of articles in the Time magazine, so I was curious to know what is his background. So I went digging, and so there was this whole portfolio of journalistic work is there available on the internet, curated very well by himself. And then you look at it, his entire body of work is pro-China, starting from 2007, 2008, a whole bunch of articles, like how India is to blame for the 1962 war. And he writes an article on Hong Kong, and he basically brings in Kashmir into that, and then says and he's written a book in collaboration with an Australian professor, and they talk about how China is not authoritarian. It's wrong to describe China as authoritarian. So it's very clear that where these things are coming from. So there are neighbors who have incentives to undermine democracy in India. And also I think we are also vulnerable because we have so much of diversity, so much of disparity in this country, that there are so many fault lines that anybody can easily exploit. And being the open democracy that we are, it's very easy for these disgruntled elements to seek a global platform and to push their agenda, their interests, and we are seeing all of this manifest in this narrative. Again, all of this is well known to all of you, so I don't have to dwell too much on these aspects. What I wanted to talk about was the whole article was based on a certain analysis that we did. So I'll briefly talk about it. I know you wanted to do a more elaborate session later on.
Yes.
But I'll just briefly touch upon
absolutely.
this. Right? And let me give the background. Like you spoke about my term at Prasar Bharati. So one of the things that I realized while at DD and AAR, that our approach to tackling global media was missing something. And this became very apparent to me during early 2020. When we were literally in firefighting mode every day. हर दिन कुछ छाप रहा था and then उसका counter लिखो, उसको कुछ narrative बनाओ and so on. And first it started with the CAA, the constitutional amendment, and majorly, right, with all those riots and then COVID-19, especially the first few months of COVID-19 were horrible because of the kind of things that were being published by the local media. And I found that our approach was very knee-jerk and reactive. It was always defensive. We were always trying to explain ourselves every single day. Right? And somehow I felt that that was not working. That was not really addressing the core of the problem. The other thing that I observed, and again it's perhaps true even today, and all of us are probably guilty of it in some way, that on social media we tend to react a lot. And that also becomes very unhelpful and counterproductive because you can't control what everyone is saying, and most of the time the reactions are very angry. Nuance is not there on social media, it's very hard. And then so it ends up beginning to look like mass trolling, and that also is not a very productive way of engaging on these issues. So I felt that our approach needed to change here. We had to take a different sort of approach, and we have to do it in a manner where the global media takes serious attention of what we are raising as legitimate concerns, right? On the manner in which they are reporting on India, and the manner in which they are projecting Indian democracy. And I felt that this requires a lot of research, data. It requires gravitas. It requires weight. So that was the trigger for this whole exercise. And so we looked at how do we analyze news items and columns that were published in major media outlets like New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Guardian, Time Magazine, and so on. And come up with some quantitative analysis, right? That both in terms of their content and also more importantly in terms of who's reading that, what kind of audience they're getting, and what are the incentives in that whole framework. So that was the background. And there was an interesting trigger to this exercise, which was an academic paper written in the 1960s by a Norwegian professor, Johan Galtung. He was one of the first ones to highlight how media tends to sensationalize negative news. And negative news-led controversies really drive media. And that has kind of become the norm across the media sector. So a large part of this analysis was around that framework that, how is playing up controversies, making an impact on these different media outlets. So we looked at about 3,000 articles as part of this whole exercise. And we looked at various South Asian reporters, columnists, and picked up about 500 of those articles. And then looked at what kind of words they use in their headlines. And it's very stunning. Most common words are fear, hate, violence, mob, riot, cow, Hindu, Muslim, Kashmir. These are the most frequent. 1 out of every 5 headlines had either Hindu or Muslim in it. So they are trying to force the whole communal sort of fault lines and reinforce it in every article. The other stunning thing to us was how strongly correlated their headlines were with controversies in India and the digital traffic associated with that. And it's a fact that their audience base in the West has saturated. They're not seeing much growth in the Western markets. The biggest market for them is English-speaking India. It's a captive audience for them. So hence there is a perverse incentive for these controversial headlines. And in fact, there is a recent a new media platform that was launched called Semaphore, and their CEO had given an interview to Business Standard where he spoke about a 250 million plus global audience for English content. I think a large part of that is going to come from India, about probably 25-30%. right? So that is the capture. And the other metric that we can see, on this phenomenon is how BBC and Deutsche Welle both have invested in bureaus in India for digital, not for regular content, digital and in Indian languages. And you can see the growth. I have some numbers that I'll share. So, for example, New York Times, when they were reporting on CAA and COVID-19, their India audience grew by 22%, while their global audience declined by 8%. So, you can see very clearly how CAA and COVID-19 were so important. Time magazine, similarly, 50% growth in India, 30% decline worldwide. So, clear contrast. BBC, 155%. So, it's just phenomenal how their traffic went up in India, especially with the manner in which they were reporting on CAA riots and so on. So clearly that is the incentive for the Western media to hype up and build this narrative. The other side is, of course, the Indian origin people who work for them. To them it is a resume enhancer, it's a career stepping stone, and also they get paid more by the Western media outlets. So that is another perverse sort of incentive. Also it becomes very clear when we look at the kind of people they are looking for. So New York Times had that job profile that they advertised on their website, where they give a very clear indication of the kind of people they're looking for. Someone who's going to build on this anti-Modi. So it's not even, there's no pretense left anymore, right? So I think that's these are all fairly well known, maybe not so much on the media stats, but otherwise generally we all know this. But also I think there's another angle to it. I don't know how many of the foreign correspondents, for example, will speak to an Anant Vijay or read his columns, go to Dainik Jagaran or Harshvardhan, right? So they only engage with the English-speaking, Delhi-based or Mumbai-based. They have very little understanding of Indian languages or Indian media across the country. So clearly their perspective is very narrow. And all of this manifests in these democracy indexes and freedom of press indices that we see, right? Because their methodology is largely dependent on what they call country experts, and the manner in which these country experts are recruited is very opaque. We have no idea who those people are, and they are paid. So these are not even like independent sort of individuals. These are individuals who have an incentive for doing that kind of work. So I looked at one of the methodologies quite closely by VDEM. I think it's the same institute that you were referring to in Stockholm.
Yes.
So their methodology involves around 6 to 7 country experts. But they say that in several cases, one expert rates multiple countries. So you're not only, if you take a diverse country like India, you may have a guy who probably barely understands the country, who's going to judge you on the basis of that. Also, the whole focus of their statistical rigor is trying to compensate for the biases of these individuals. So they have 6 or 7 country experts. How do they model the statistics where their bias is reduced? So their whole focus is just that. And what we don't know is, how many of them are based in India, how many of them have an understanding of India. We have no clue on any of that. Also, how can you have the same number of experts for a billion people democracy, and democracy is probably the size of a South Delhi municipal corporation, right? I mean, clearly there's a scale problem there. And if you look at the kind of questions, they're very subjective, right? And it's all perception based. So for example, if you ask, are more journalists being arrested in India? Probably they'll say yes, but then on the scale of billion, I mean, it is not even a fraction, right? It's probably third decimal or fourth decimal. It's nothing. So the model does not have any aspects to normalize for a large democracy versus a small democracy. So that is, I think, clearly missing in their approach. Another thing that I don't see is, for example, federalism, right? We have a fairly federal structure where state governments have independent authority to, to manage the law and order and so on. So how can you take random cases spread across states and then pass judgment on the central government? So that is another aspect which is completely missed out. Now, if you say that, democracy is on the decline in the last 5-6 years, just on this one count of federalism, right? I mean, there have been no cases of Article 356 being misapplied and, duly elected governments being dismissed. Not even one case. So these are things that are not reflected in these models and frameworks. So that's another problem or a gap that I see, where most of their focus is largely what they call liberal democracy, which is, I think, about freedom of press and checks and balances. So their whole idea is that, how adversarial is the Supreme Court, how obstructionist is the Supreme Court. Only then it is liberal enough. Otherwise, we're probably not liberal enough for them. Right? I think that those are where the problems lie. So what should be the response, right? And I feel that it's not enough to write these articles or have long tweet threads. I don't think that will solve the problem. What we need is a very institutional approach. I think that way, I think it's a great initiative that you've taken at the foundation. Is seized on this the issue because the response has to be institutional and the approach has to have academic rigor. So in fact, when we did this research report, that was one question to me, that how should we put this out there, right? Because if it becomes a Prasar Bharati or a Doordarshan report, nobody is going to read it. Because Sarkari, it will be considered a Sarkari report, which is why we said, we'll publish it in a peer-reviewed journal and we'll not link it to Prasar Bharati in any way. And that got it then its legitimacy. The other interesting thing is now, because it is published in a peer-reviewed journal, it also appears on Google Scholar and other places, so others can cite it,
Yes.
right? So it creates a much wider body of knowledge. I think that is what we need to aspire for. Create an ecosystem where think tanks, fellows in various universities, academic scholars, they come together and build on this body of work. And that becomes an authentic reference point, because today our problem is that there is no authentic reference point, right? And it's all anecdotal. It is individuals reacting. So one very interesting platform that I saw recently was the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's very brilliantly organized, very rigorous, cross-referenced, and a whole body of knowledge. Something like that has to be built for India and Indian democracy, I think, where all these aspects are brought out in a very rigorous way, where it's very hard for them to, because these things stand on themselves. They are not a Sarkari project, they are not a BJP project. They are based on their own merits and strength, and that then maybe becomes the basis for new indices of democracy, new frameworks, which uniquely reflect what is unique about India and Indian democracy. So I think that's broadly what I had in mind in terms of thoughts that I wanted to share. So happy to hear reactions and questions.